Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are all around the world, in any city, state, or country. Hi, this is another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Teresa Canada. And today we have a special guest. As you know, all my guests are special, who's going to talk about her new book and her experience in writing about her new book about Black history in the city of Philadelphia. And for those of you who don't know, Philadelphia is in the state of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a state in the north. And much of my podcast talked about things that took place in the northern part of the United States as opposed to the southern part of the United States and part of the Midwest. So this is an opportune time to hear some other histories that took place in the city of Philadelphia. So I'm going to introduce you to my guest, Miss Amy Cohen. She spent 20 years as a middle and high school social studies teacher. In 2013, she became the director of education at the film company History Making Productions, where she developed educational materials to accompany documentaries mostly about the history of Philadelphia. Amy produced Octavius versus Cato, A Legacy for the 21st Century, which won a Mid-Atlantic Emmy Award for Historic Cultural Program Feature. Amy is a frequent contributor to Hidden City, an online magazine about Philadelphia's history and built environment. Her first book, and hopefully not her last, is titled Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape, Deep Roots, Continuing Legacy. And it was published by Temple University Press this year, 2024. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Appreciate you taking this time to talk about your research, the book, and all the exciting things that took place. I'm really fascinated. I can't finish help but think about all the things I looked at the book chapter. I'm ready to just get into this. As you know, I have historical background as well, based upon my research on New York City public schools and desegregation of that through the eyes of 7 Black and brown girls who experienced that. So this is kind of like segue, because I think about your background as an educator and now a writer, and also the fact that you talk about the city of Philadelphia in terms of the Black history. And I'm fascinated about what made you select this particular topic to write about.
Well, sure. Okay. So to explain how I got into the topic, it really has to relate back to the time when I was a teacher. So in 2005, the school district of Philadelphia became the first district in the country to require a year of African American history. And of course, at that point, no one in my social studies department had taught Black history. There were no Black members of the social studies department, which is pretty typical across the city and across the country. And I had been teaching a little bit about the history of Philadelphia. And you can't learn Philadelphia history without learning Black history. So I volunteered to teach the course. So right from the start, I always included a lot of Philadelphia history. But the learning curve was really steep, but I learned a whole lot during the 8 years I was teaching the course. Then, as you said in the intro, I worked for a local documentary film company, and we made films about local history, often about Black history. And then I started writing for this local publication, Hidden City. And, it occurred to me, first of all, I went from a true novice to really an expert.
Okay.
And also that all along, between my students and their parents and my colleagues, our film audiences, our Hidden City readers, there was such a hunger, so much interest in local Black history, and not a book like mine, which is really aimed at the general reader. It's not an academic book.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I came to write about the topic of local Black history.
Okay, so it's interesting. Like I said, you think about your experience having been a teacher, and I suppose it's interesting. I didn't know this. I'm glad that you mentioned about what happened in Philadelphia schools. That's really unique, and it's interesting. This was 2005. You said they said that was a requirement, and I don't think many people knew that. And in many places they don't, and now it may not be a requirement. You see what happens.
Very
right?
few, very few.
Very, very rare. That's wonderful, though. So that's a good experience. Now, what exactly, can you just give us an overview of the book and the different people that you discuss in the book? And then at some point, there's one of the chapters I really want to know more about, and that's the one on the brief life of Malcolm X High School and what is in a name. So can you just give?
So the way the book is set up, it's 19 chapters, which kind of operate as case studies.
Yeah.
So it's set up chronologically from the late 1600s to about 1969, early 1970s. And each of the 19 chapters tells the story of either an individual, an event, an institution relevant to Black history, and then it looks at how it's represented in the current landscape, whether that's through a memorial, a monument, a historical marker, a street name, a park, a school. And the way the book works, if one is not familiar with local Black history, after reading the book, they should have a pretty good sense of it.
Okay.
If they're already familiar with local Black history, I hope that they'll see it through a different lens, this lens of the landscape. And then at the end of each chapter, well, at the end of about half of the chapters, there are reflections either by people who were part of getting this history recognized in the landscape, or with the more recent history, people who actually participated in the history. Shared reflections. And then for every chapter, there's a to-do list of either sites to visit or, easily accessible videos to watch or primary sources to find online so that people can continue their study. Because again, it's an overview. Each chapter is about 10 pages. There's more to be learned on every topic.
Did you provide, what, in a sense, is your goal long-term for the impact of the book?
My initial goal with the book was just to feed this hunger that I mentioned earlier. I really thought people would be interested. And, I've just had so many, well-educated, long-term Philadelphia folks say to me, I never knew there was slavery in Philadelphia. That was really kind of my initial impetus. And then once the book was written, I realized it could be really useful in classrooms, again, because of the way it's so accessible. And fortunately, right now, the School District of Philadelphia in the Black History course is trying to pivot toward more local Black history.
Good.
So, now I'm focusing somewhat on trying to get the book into schools, but really just getting the word out there.
Well, this should help because I have a lot of educators who watch my podcast, a significant number. And not just, K through 12, but also college professors who may be using this as a source. And the courses, I know people who teach courses that relate to this historical place, especially the focus on Northern versus Southern. And that's one of the things that I wanted to talk more about because, we all know about a lot of that history in the southern part of the country, especially Black history, but they know very little, if anything, about what's taking place in the northern part of the country. So I was fascinated when I heard about your book. I said, I've got to get her to talk about this book. So people can know this is not just, I talk about New York City, but this is Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell, the whole bit, right? And so I'm just saying it has to be, you have to think about that. And I think this is a wonderful way to educate throughout, not just there are adults who have no clue. There are probably people who grew up in Philadelphia who don't know the information that you've shared. So what do you think about that?
Especially in a city like Philadelphia, where we take so much pride in being the home of the Liberty Bell, and we're the Quaker city and the city of brotherly love. And, we love to talk about, we were a center of abolition and the Underground Railroad. And those things are true. In the 1830s, most Philadelphians were either indifferent to or supportive of slavery. I tell the story in the book of a hall that was built by abolitionists because it had gotten so hard for them to even find space to rent to meet in. That hall was burnt down on the third day after it opened by a Philly mob. And that mob got away with it because the sentiments of the majority of the city were anti-abolitionists. So I think it certainly changed my view of my hometown when I incorporated local Black history into the course. And I think as people are reading it, they're really surprised.
Well, like I said, just I was just fascinated by all the different people who are, who have been exposed or discussed in your book. It's a wonderful array of how their impact is or was in the city of Philadelphia, because many people are unaware of that. So I said this would be a good way to talk about how cities in the North dealt with Black history differently, maybe differently than they did in the South, and how people were able to accomplish certain things. So can you share a couple of, like, maybe one or two of the chapters that you found that you want to share with the audience, that the issues that you talk about in the book? Just maybe one or two of the chapters. Now, there's one I wanted you to talk about specifically about the brief history about the Malcolm X High School. Do you want to start with that chapter?
Sure, I can start with that one. I mean, chronologically, that's toward the end of the book, but that's
Right.
okay. And that was a chapter where, a lot of the chapters were full of information I was pretty familiar with beforehand. Some were actually based on articles I'd written for Hidden City. That chapter was one where I learned a lot. I was always sort of fascinated by this story that I had heard about Malcolm X High School being the informal name of Benjamin Franklin High School for a couple of years in the 60s.
Okay.
So before I get into that part of the story, I'll take you through my process, which was I wanted to look into Malcolm X in Philadelphia, and I wasn't aware how much time Malcolm X had spent in Philadelphia during the period when he was still working for Reverend Elijah Muhammad, and he was coming to Philly to set up temples and to grow the Nation of Islam in Philly, and he actually spent quite a bit of time here.
Okay.
But that was if I'm remembering correctly, late 1950s, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. But, of course, Malcolm X was assassinated 1965. So in the late 1960s, which was a period much more of kind of the Black Power ethos, there were students who organized at Benjamin Franklin High School and said, we don't want our school to be named after a slave owner. And Benjamin Franklin, unlike many of the founding fathers, was not an owner of enslaved people on a massive scale.
Okay.
Early in his life was the owner of a few enslaved people, but his publication, the Pennsylvania Gazette, was full of runaway ads, and he certainly had his ties to slavery. Toward the end of his life, he became the head of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. But anyway, these young folks organized and initially had some support from their administration. And Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's widow, came to Philadelphia and was there when they, symbolically hung a handmade sign saying Malcolm X High School over the Ben Franklin High School sign. I had students who in 2008 had done a project in my class about this period. And I remember they had a bust of Malcolm X that had sat in the hallway, and they had these notebooks that, in the way like school will have its name on a notebook, it would say, Malcolm X High School. There was a basketball schedule for the Xers, which was the name of the team briefly. And so I contacted these students who had graduated high school in 2010, but through the wonders of the internet, I found the students and I said, "Who was it who gave you all this stuff? Who did you talk to?"
Right.
And they said, "Oh, it's this guy, Coach Kenneth Hamilton." And I was able to get in touch with him. And he lives not at all far from me, and went and spent time with him. And he had been a teacher, a coach, administrator. He taught at the school and coached there eventually for over 30 years. And these were, a few of the years. And he just shared with me what those times were like and why he chose to support the students. There were like official efforts to try and change the name of the school. Students went before the school board, and members of the school board said no. But they agreed the next time a new high school was built in Philadelphia, it'd be named for a Black person. So the next school was what we now know here as the Martin Luther King High School. So it's just kind of an interesting chapter. And then someone just like you who reached out to me through my website. I just heard from a guy last week, and he said it was so interesting. He had gone into the Peace Corps in 1967 and dug wells in Burkina Faso for 2 years. And then he came back. It's the Vietnam War era. He got a low draft lottery number. So he went to teach in the public schools to not get drafted. And he was at Malcolm X High School. Well, he was at Ben Franklin when it's called Malcolm X High School. So I've been emailing with him because I want to get, the story a little more fleshed out. But it's one of these obscure chapters. Yes.
Did that, I mean, okay, with the idea of renaming the school or making it, the Malcolm, the high, the X school and the Xers, was there any focus on curriculum within the school that you're aware of that may also been part of this process as well?
Yes. That there was an emphasis on more curriculum and more teachers. The principal at that time was a man named Leon Bass, was a Black man. He spoke on civil rights and kind of tolerance issues for years because during his time serving the Second World War, he helped to liberate, I believe, Buchenwald concentration camp. So,
wow.
So there was Black leadership at the school.
Okay.
I don't know as much about ins and outs of, I think that Leon Bass went from supporting the idea of calling it Malcolm X High School to not supporting it. Unfortunately, our school district doesn't have great archives, so most of the research I could do was through interviewing this Kenneth Hamilton, who also wrote a reflection, and newspapers. And newspapers kind of jump around in time.
Okay.
One thing that might be of interest is one of the organizers of changing the school name and this whole movement was a student who initially was known as Wesley Cook. They were able to get a Swahili class at the school, and he changed his name to Mumia Abu Jamal.
Okay. So there were some cultural things that took place as well.
Yeah, who is famously on death row in Pennsylvania, and that was part of where he got his political start.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because I think people need to learn more about these histories that they are not necessarily well known, because it gives people a different perspective on the contributions of places throughout the North, specifically the North and Midwest, that people have no idea about. And also it allows people to have an ability to kind of like have a commonality that we are lacking so much in our society right now. And I think that you brought this to light to allow people to get another perspective of issues and information that they were clueless about. Even people, for example, have you gotten any feedback from people who are just learning about this? What has been the feedback of people just learning about this? And they may have been Philadelphians all their life. What's your sense? Have you gotten a chance to speak to some of those people or get reactions from them?
About the broad scope of Black history in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, people, not surprisingly, especially white people, but so, again, so many people have said they didn't know there was slavery in Philadelphia. And like most of our country, enslaved people helped to build Philadelphia. And I think it might be good to talk about another chapter now, which is earlier chronologically. It's about the period from about 1790 to 1840, when Philadelphia was the free Black center. of the country. And it was just a time of, even though there were still a number of enslaved African Americans at the end of the 18th century, really by that point, most of the Black people in the city were members of the free Black community, and they had two incredibly able leaders. Well, they had many incredibly able leaders, but the two that stand out are Richard Allen, who went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal
Churches, right?
denomination, and Absalom Jones, who founded St. Thomas African Episcopal Church. They started a mutual aid group called the Free Africa Society. They organized Black folks to help out when the yellow fever epidemic struck in 1792. They were then accused of profiteering and robbing from the people who were sick. They refuted that in writing, point by point. And they really were able to build, in spite of everything, a community that had schools, that had literature societies, that, had numerous churches. And there's a project in Philadelphia right now I really want to shout out called the 1838 Metropolis. If people just Google that, these two younger women have been going through a census that was done of the Black population in 1838, and they're just being able to show how many Black-owned businesses, how many skilled jobs, and really, just a very different picture than many people have of, early 19th century Black people.
And the contributions they've made to the city of Philadelphia, correct?
Yeah. And the reason for that, the reason that the census was done is because Black people were threatened with losing the right to vote. Black people, not in numbers, but some Black people had been voting because there was a constitution that didn't explicitly prevent Blacks from voting. And there were wealthy, successful Black entrepreneurs like James Forten, who had voted. But then in 1838, in spite of all these efforts to try and keep the vote, they did lose it. But now we're at least benefiting from all that research that was done to get a really different picture of an urban Black community in the 1830s.
Interesting, very interesting perspective. The people don't understand sometimes where they go from here to there. They think, oh, this just happened just recently. But you have outlined from the very beginning up until pretty much recently what that experience has been in the city of Philadelphia, which is a wealth of information. And it's interesting because it's a northern city. And basically it talks about, that people were enslaved in Philadelphia or in the state of Pennsylvania as a whole. And that's good information to share. And that people know what can be learned from these experiences and how the contributions were made by different Black people along the line, not just now. So in essence, I want you to just, we're winding up a little bit here, but I want you to tell me, what is it that you really want people to take away from your research and your writings?
Okay. So a few things. One, as you just alluded to, is I want people to understand that the Black president's presence in Philadelphia is long and deep and continuing. I want people to understand that even in the city of brotherly love, the Quaker city, that we did have slavery, and it's just one more example of the ways in which enslaved people built the country. And a corollary to that is the continuing impact of that and segregation, which we did have in Philadelphia, and systemic racism in the form of, redlining and not funding schools, and all of those things come into play in the later chapters, lack of economic opportunity. So kind of the long and continuous frame. And then finally, because it is a book about how history is shown in the landscape, it was said to me again and again and again as I was talking to people while I was researching and writing the book that these things matter. A mural, a monument, a marker. It's not going to correct the injustices of the past. It's not going to ensure a more equal future, but they matter. And when I speak about the book, I always end with a quote from the young poet Amanda Gorman, her poem, The Hill We Climb, that she wrote for Biden's inauguration. She
Right.
says in it, being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And I think, I hope that when people read my book, they realize that they can be a part of the repair.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for just using that piece of the poem in terms of closing this episode. And I think it speaks well of how you've gone through this process and how it hopefully lays the landscape for moving forward and adding on to that, leaving some legacy down the line here. And I think that's so important. So thank you so much for participating in this podcast and sharing information about your book and all the research you've done to let us know about historical issues of Black history in the city of Philadelphia. And hopefully I'll look forward to the next book.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
That's wonderful. Okay, everyone, this was another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters. I appreciate you being here. We look forward to you at the next episode. And again, I thank my guest today, Ms. Amy Cohen, and her book, if you don't remember what the name of the book is. Amy, can you tell us the name of the book?
Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape, Deep Roots, Continuing Legacy from Temple University Press.
Thank you so much. Okay, everyone, thank you. We'll see you next time. Have a great day, evening, or night, wherever you are around the world. Bye now.